today. And the very first structure is the only one that's really not numbered on this diagram. And often hearts are not drawn with this particular bit of tissue on them. And that's because if we were to draw it, you wouldn't be able to see what was inside the heart. So the pericardium is the tissue surrounding the heart. Much like you had pleural membranes surrounding your lungs, you have something called pericardium surrounding your heart. So it's not actually numbered on the diagram, but it would be tissue covering the surface of the heart. And its job, much like the pleural membrane, is that it reduces friction. It makes sure that your heart is protected so that it doesn't rub up against your ribs, against your lungs, against the other organs inside of your thoracic cavity. Now, when we dissect hearts, the pericardium is usually already removed, and that's so that you get a clean view of the heart. But when we dissect a fetal pig a little bit later on, nothing will have been removed already, and you should be able to see the pericardium in that case. So the first thing that we're going to talk about in terms of the structures of your heart are the chambers. So there's two types of chambers. They are called atria and ventricles. Now these two spaces at the top, this one and this one, represent the atria. Atria is the plural word. If I wanted a singular word, I would say atrium, just like the atrium that we have in our school. The atrium is a chamber, it's a space. Now the atria's function is to collect or receive blood. They are the two pieces, or the two parts of your heart that receive blood when it's pumped back into your heart coming from different body structures. So structure number 5 and structure over here, number, what do we got here, 11, are the two atria. Remember that when you look at anatomical diagrams, left is right and right is left. So your left atrium is number 11, your right atrium is number 5. Now atria collectively always have a vein that brings blood to them. So there will always be a vein attached to the left and the right atria. So they're the first spot that blood goes when it enters your heart. The ventricles are the pumps. They are more muscular, they are larger. The ventricles' job is to take the blood that flows into them from the atria and pump it out to your body. So they pump blood from the atria. So on the diagram, number 7 is your right ventricle. So it's this big space that kind of looks like the letter V, very conveniently. And your left ventricle is number 14. This other big structure, chamber that looks like a V. And you can clearly see the sort of gray space around. That's where we're representing muscle and tissue. And the ventricles are thicker. They have thicker walls, there's thicker muscles there. So when I talk about blood flow, which we'll talk about as we go through this anatomy today, blood is coming into your atria and going towards your ventricles. So those are the 4 chambers of your heart. Atria on top, ventricles on the bottom. Now, this is not my French immersion class, but I'm going to tell you this anyways. In French, the word for atria is tiny ear. And that's because if you look at it, they kind of look like two tiny Mickey Mouse ears on the top. And I think that that makes a really good visual connection between where the atria are. So I'm not expecting you to know the word, but maybe you might associate that with the appearance of these two little Mickey Mouse ears. So there are 4 chambers. Conveniently, everything will be in groups of 4. There will be 4 chambers, 4 valves, and 4 major blood vessels. So you always know, if you count and you have 4, then you know all of the pieces in that particular section. Does anyone want to ask any questions or need this up on the screen still? Okay. Now we're going to talk about the major blood vessels. Now the first blood vessel, even though I said there's groups of 4, I'm counting this as 1 because it's 2 branches of the same blood vessel. We're talking about the inferior vena cava and the superior vena cava. The inferior vena cava is number 8 on the diagram. The superior vena cava is number 2. Now these are both branches of the same major vein. So this is a vein. Now inferior means below, superior means above. So the inferior vena cava brings blood to the right atrium from your lower body. And by lower body, we mean below your shoulders. Anything that's below your shoulders comes through the inferior vena cava. The superior vena cava brings blood to your right atrium from your upper body. That means shoulders or higher. So both of those blood vessels kind of come together and are attached to the right atrium. So if we're talking about blood flow, blood is coming in these 2 veins, and it ends up coming into the atria. Now when we dissect the heart, you will be able to feel that in the back of the atria, there's a hole, there's a space, and that's how the vein is attached. There's actually a hole there, so the blood can get from the vein into the atria. Now the other kind of vein that you have is your pulmonary vein. And I'm just going to put a little star. The pulmonary vein is the exception to the rule about oxygen. So remember that your pulmonary vein carries oxygenated blood. Most veins have deoxygenated blood. Blood where all the oxygen has been used up because it just went to your body and dropped all of the oxygen off. Your pulmonary vein has oxygenated blood, and it enters the left atrium. You'll notice that it's pretty common here because we have a left and a right for me to just use the first letter, an L or an R, capitalized with a period after it indicating left or right. You can do that too. So when I take a look over here at your pulmonary veins or pulmonary arteries, they're the things that are sticking out in behind. And on this particular picture, because of the way it's set up, it is not particularly obvious which one is which. When we dissect hearts, you'll be able to tell because veins are thinner and arteries are thicker, and you'll be able to see actually what it's attached to because you'll be able to follow the path of the blood vessel. So let's situate ourselves. This over here, this is our right atrium. So we're looking for the blood vessels that are entering the right atrium. Now, since they're coming from in behind, it's a little more difficult to see where they are. But on this picture, number 10 represents pulmonary veins. Now, these are the left pulmonary veins. Since you have 2 lungs, you need veins that go both ways. So on the other side, you have number 4, and number 4 are your right pulmonary veins. And that's because you need veins going from your heart to both of your left lung and your right lung. Does anyone want to ask any questions about veins so far? I'll just make a note here that the vena cava has deoxygenated blood. Now, if we continue on, we're talking about arteries, and we have 2 major arteries. So everything comes in nice little groups. There's 2 atria, 2 ventricles, 2 arteries, 2 veins. So the 2 arteries start with the pulmonary artery. The pulmonary artery carries deoxygenated blood which is unusual. Usually arteries have oxygen in them. And the reason this one has deoxygenated blood is because it hasn't gone to your lungs yet. It takes deoxygenated blood from your right ventricle to your lungs. So if we take a look at the right ventricle, it's over here. And you can see there's this little pathway leaving. That is where your pulmonary artery originates. So that means that on the diagram, number 9 is a branch of your pulmonary artery. The other part of your pulmonary artery, so this one is your left pulmonary artery. The other branch of your pulmonary artery is this piece kind of coming out the back. It's number 3. And that is your right pulmonary artery. So number 9 and number 3 represent the 2 pieces of your pulmonary artery. Now the last blood vessel is the easiest one to recognize because it has a weird shape and it looks different. It is your aorta. It is number 1 on the picture. And it's also number 15. Number 1 is the top cross of your aorta, which is an artery. And number 15 is showing how your aorta goes down to your lower body, as well as these branches that will go off towards your upper body. So your aorta is taking blood from your left ventricle. So I'm just going to come down here. It's taking oxygenated blood from your left ventricle to the rest of your body. And your aorta will eventually branch into lots of other arteries. So if you remember the other day I showed you the names of a bunch of arteries, your femoral artery, your iliac artery, they all branch off of your aorta. The aorta is the main one that is supplying all of those other blood vessels. Since your left ventricle is this guy down here, we're going to follow this pathway that kind of goes in behind. And so you'll notice that the atria is the atrium is more to the outside, and this blood vessel is more to the inside. But that's the way that blood goes when it's flowing out of your ventricle up through to your aorta. Now, would anyone like to ask any questions at all about blood vessels? So we have chambers, we have blood vessels. The last thing that we need to talk about are valves. We need ways of making sure that blood goes the way that it is supposed to go. So the last thing that we need to discuss are heart valves. So still looking at this same picture, we have 4 valves. 2 of the valves are attached to arteries, and 2 of the valves are between chambers. So everything is coming in pairs, and then each set of pairs makes up a nice group of 4. The valves that are attached to arteries are always called semilunar valves, and it's because of their shape. If you think about what lunar means, it's talking about the moon, so we're talking about a shape that's like half of a moon. The bicuspid and tricuspid valves are named with prefixes representing how many sections they have. The bicuspid valve has sort of 2 parts, the tricuspid valve has 3. So if we start by talking about the aortic semilunar valve, it is the valve between your left ventricle and your aorta. So on the diagram, right here, number 13 is your aortic semilunar valve. Now we mentioned valves earlier when we talked about veins. Veins have valves all over the place, not just at the entrance and exit to heart chambers, but the function is the same. All of these valves are trying to prevent blood from going the wrong way. Blood is supposed to go from your atria to your ventricle and then out through your arteries. And those valves are necessary to make sure blood is going the correct direction. So we have, we'll just clean this up a bit. We have this first valve here, your aortic semilunar valve. The pulmonary semilunar valve is the one that is between your right ventricle and your pulmonary artery. So your pulmonary semilunar valve is this one, which didn't happen to get a number on the diagram. Now the other 2 valves, like I said, connect chambers of your heart. So they're always between your atria and your ventricles. Bicuspid and tricuspid are their names. And there are a number of tricks that you can use to remember which one comes first. Unfortunately, they don't really have a direct association with left or right, but when we start talking about blood flow, the tricuspid valve comes first, and so I always remember that it goes not in alphabetical order. Tricuspid comes first. It seems like it's bigger, it should come second, but it actually comes first. So the tricuspid valve is number 6, right here. And the bicuspid valve is number 12, right over here. Now the bicuspid valve has another name, if I could write English letters. It has been called the mitral valve. I prefer bicuspid because that talks about its actual structure, but depending on the resource that we're referring to, you might see it referred to as the mitral valve. Now the tricuspid valve is between your right atrium and ventricle, and your bicuspid valve is between your left atrium and ventricle. So we have 4 chambers, we have 4 major blood vessels, and we have 4 heart valves. So we are going to talk about blood flow through the heart. Now the picture of the heart here is a little less realistic because it shows all of the veins and arteries as though they were perfect little highways, not crisscrossing over each other or squishing each other at all. So it shows it a little more separately. You have your own diagram of the heart. I'm just having that picture there so that I can show you where each word goes. As we talk about blood flow through the heart, the first place, or the place where I usually start, is the vena cava, because that is how blood gets back into your heart. So the vena cava is here and here. Those are the 2 pieces of the vena cava. After it goes to the vena cava, we have your right atrium. So that's part number 2. After the right atrium, we have the tricuspid valve. So there's number 3. So if you're following this, blood flows into the right side of your heart to the top chamber, and then it flows downwards. Your right ventricle is the 4th piece. So there's the right ventricle. After the right ventricle, pulmonary semilunar valve. Question. Sorry? The order that it goes through? Well, I'm going to ask you it, so I would. So we're on number 5, pulmonary semilunar valve. Now what you might want to do, since you have a picture already, is just number things on the picture, show where, maybe draw an arrow on your picture to show where the blood is going. It's totally up to you, but you do need to know the path that blood takes through your heart. So the pulmonary semilunar valve is there. That's 5. Now after the pulmonary semilunar valve, it goes up to the pulmonary artery. And your pulmonary artery, remember, has 2 branches, one on the left and one on the right. And then it goes to your lungs. Now your lungs are not often drawn on the picture because we're focusing on the structures of the heart. But so that you know, your lung would be over here. It would be in between your pulmonary artery and your pulmonary vein. So an artery would go into your lung, a vein would come out. So your lungs would be number 7. Pulmonary vein, 8. So the pulmonary vein has 2 branches, just like the pulmonary artery. And your pulmonary vein goes into your left atrium, which we'll call number 9. So that's your left atrium, always to the top chamber of the heart first. It flows through the bicuspid valve, so that's number 10. Then your left ventricle. After your left ventricle, your aortic semilunar valve. So that would be up here. Then finally, your aorta. Now you'll see this word dorsal. It's just referring to the position. Dorsal means towards the back side, and so you can call it just the aorta. The dorsal aorta is referring to its position in your body. So your aorta, which is right here, and which branches down over here, would be the 13th piece. And then finally, body parts. So any other organ that is receiving blood would be getting it from a branch that comes from your aorta. So after your aorta, you'll see these little branches here. Anything that is upper body gets one of those branches. Anything that is lower body comes off of that big branch of the aorta that goes downwards. And so one of the things that's really important for you to recognize, now that we know all these pieces, right side is always deoxygenated blood. Left side, oxygenated. That's because on the right side, blood hasn't gone to your lungs yet. On the left side, it has. Now we'll talk about the function of your heart in our next lesson. But so that you know, so that blood is being pumped in sort of a uniform way, the atria always contract simultaneously. So your left and right atria pump at the same time. They contract and push blood down into your ventricles at the same time. Then both of your ventricles contract simultaneously. That makes sense. If blood is going to come back into my heart, I need to send blood out of my heart. So the atria and the ventricle are always working at the same time. Both of them contract or both of them relax. Now, some of you might say, how in the world am I ever going to remember this ridiculously long list of parts and what order they go in? So I have a couple of suggestions for you for strategies that you can use to remember the path of blood through your heart. So I'm going to show you a couple of these strategies now. Strategy number one that I'll show you is to use a little mnemonic. This is where I make up a ridiculous word or sentence so that I can remember the sequence that things go in. So I will tell you mine, and I'll tell you how I came about this because it's fun. When I was in university, there was a girl named Patty in my lab group, and she had a van. It looked like the kind of van that someone would try to abduct children in. We called it various names. Usually we called it the Chester van because it rhymes with a word that yeah, there you go. So anyways, she had this awesome van. So here was my mnemonic. Vans, cars, autos, trucks. And then I said, very pretty people like Patty all believe vans are awesome. That's my sentence. Now, many of my students have come up with their own ridiculous, somewhat silly sentence, and I encourage you to do that. I'll show you what the letters represent for me. The V and the C are vena cava. The A is an atrium. The T is for tricuspid. The V, ventricle. The P, and there's a few P's in a row. The first P is for the pulmonary semilunar valve. The second P is for pulmonary artery. Then lungs. Then pulmonary vein. Another atrium. Bicuspid valve, another ventricle, then the aortic semilunar valve, and the aorta. Now, my mnemonic is not perfect. It doesn't say anything about left and right. I just had to remember that the right side came first. But there's something that you could use. Lots of people have come up with lots of different little mnemonics to remember this sequence. And you can use different letters. You'll notice that I used 2 letters for vena cava. You might want to instead just use 1 letter and maybe use 2 letters for atria so you know whether it's right or left. That would be something that you could do. So this is something that you could do with words. You could make up a little sentence that would help you remember this pathway. So here's way number 2. Instead of representing the heart as kind of a V-shaped thing with all these weird shaped cavities, I know that my heart has 4 chambers, 2 on each side, 1 on top of the other. So a simplified way to represent the structures of the heart would be to draw a rectangle or square, whatever you like, and to make 4 sections in it. That way, that side's right, and that side's left. Now we know that there's 4 of everything. 4 chambers, 4 valves, 4 blood vessels. We know that the valves go here and here. So there's my 4 chambers, there's my 4 valves. Then I know that there are 4 types of blood vessels. There are the blood vessels that go into my right atrium, so this way, and into my left atrium, like that. And there are the blood vessels that come out of my right atrium and out of my out of my right ventricle and out of my left ventricle. So there are 4 chambers, 4 valves, 4 blood vessels. This is a simplified way to represent all of them. Now this doesn't remind you of the names, but perhaps reminding you of the structure will help you remember what pieces you have and don't have. This is an atrium. Atriums are always on top. This is a ventricle, and so is this. Ventricles are always on the bottom. Now between atria and ventricles are always the cuspid valves. So this is the tricuspid, and that's bicuspid. Between the ventricles and arteries are always semilunar valves. So this is your pulmonary semilunar valve, and that's your aortic semilunar valve. Now if I name the blood vessels, that's my vena cava, and that's my pulmonary vein. And on the bottom, what comes out on this side is my pulmonary artery, and over here, my aorta. And if I were to connect this, because your circulatory system is a continuous loop, I would say that my lungs are right here. That's the connection between my pulmonary vein and my pulmonary artery. And I would say that my other body parts, any other organ, would come off of a branch of the aorta. And that's how I could follow a continuous path of blood through the heart. So the direction of blood is always going like this. So you'll see the arrows, we follow the arrows around, blood comes down. But that would be another way to represent blood flow through the heart without looking at an anatomical diagram of your heart. So we're talking about the regulation of your heartbeat. What controls your heartbeat? Your heart has a built-in conduction system, and by this we're talking about electrical. So you have like a little circuit in your heart, and this little circuit, this little conduction system, takes electrical signals, sends them to different parts of your heart, and that's what tells your heart tissue, your heart muscles, that they need to contract. So there are two parts that are of particular importance to us: the sinoatrial node and the AV node, which is the atrioventricular node. Now a node means like a collection or a bundle of fibers that are all meeting in the same spot. So your SA or sinoatrial node, you'll notice on my picture, is this collection. It's at the top. It's like a bundle. And it is located in your right atrium. So this is the part of your heart's built-in conduction system that starts each cardiac cycle. So every set of heartbeats starts with this particular thing being stimulated. Now, how is it stimulated? That goes a little beyond the scope of our course. Then we would be getting into nerves, nerve pathways, and if you choose to do Bio20E, there is an entire chapter just about that. But it's getting a signal. It's getting a signal from nerves that's coming from your brain that's telling your heart to beat. So it is what we call the pacemaker. You might know someone who has a pacemaker. If you have a pacemaker, it's because this does not work. This particular structure in your heart is malfunctioning. It's not functioning quickly enough, or it's not functioning correctly. Perhaps it's been damaged. But if someone has a pacemaker, it's to take the place of this piece of the heart. So it's in the upper right corner. Remember that on a picture, that actually looks like the left. Now what does it do? It causes the contraction of the atria. So when this node, this piece of the conduction system is stimulated, it makes the atria contract. Now there are some names for all of these fibers, and the names are also beyond the scope of our course. But you could see, for example, this little dotted pathway that's going around to your left and right atrium. One of them is called Bachman's bundle. There's some other pathways. But basically, there are little pathways running from that node to both of the atria of your heart that cause them to contract. When they contract, they push blood forward. It also stimulates the next node in the pathway, which is the AV node. So the AV node, which stands for atrioventricular node, and it's named that way because if you look at its position, it's right where the atria and ventricle meet each other. So it's giving you a clue as to its location. So what do we need to know about the AV node? It stimulates the muscles of the ventricles to contract. Now there are a couple of names of fibers that often get mentioned. Your textbook uses them as well. So I just want to make sure that you recognize what they are. There are these things called Purkinje fibers. Now if you look at my picture of the heart, around each ventricle is a big fiber that wraps around and then has a bunch of branches off of it. Those are the Purkinje fibers. The bundle of His, not his, but His, is where those two fibers branch off. Now the names of all of the bundles of fibers is not the main idea. The main idea is, do you know which one comes first? The SA node comes first. Do you know what happens when each of the nodes are stimulated? SA node causes the atria to contract, and then it stimulates the AV node, then the ventricles contract. So this is fantastic information. How am I going to ask you to apply it? Well, that's what I'll show you on the next page. So before I go there, does anyone have any questions about where one of the nodes is, maybe what it does, or anything about what's on the screen? So we are going to talk about ECGs, and this is the last thing that we're going to do today. An ECG is an electrocardiogram. So the E stands for electro, the C stands for cardio, the G stands for gram. Have any of you had an ECG done on you before? It's fairly cool to watch your own heartbeat. I know when I was in the hospital having my daughter, of course I'm attached to 800 machines, and I kind of liked watching my own heartbeat on the screen. It was cool. So it's a printout. It doesn't have to be a printout. Things are becoming more digital now. It could just be on a digital screen. In the olden days, I know at the High River Hospital, when I was getting monitored before I had my daughter, they actually printed one out, like a piece of paper was coming out of a really old-looking printer, recording my heartbeat and the baby's heartbeat and all this other kind of stuff. So it doesn't have to be a printout, but it's showing me the electrical activity of the heart. In other words, the SA and AV node. Now, I'm not going to ask you to memorize how long each section of a heartbeat lasts or how much electricity. You'll see that there are volts on one side and time along the bottom. What I want to focus on is the shape of the ECG and relate that to what's happening in your heart in each step of this little printout that we see. So page 275, again, is showing you visibly what happens in your heart. Here's what you need to know. The P wave. So it's the first tiny little bump that you see in the ECG. This is when atrial stimulation starts. So that means that the SA node is telling the atria to contract. Now the next thing isn't actually a letter, but moreover the absence of something. Between P and the next thing, Q, there's a space. So I'm going to call that the PQ interval. It's the space between P and Q. And this space is necessary for the ventricles to fill. Blood moving doesn't happen instantaneously. It's not like a nerve impulse where, boom, it's there, it's not even a second. It takes actual measurable time, not a long amount of time, but it takes some time for all of the blood that your atria collected from your veins to transfer from your atria down to your ventricle. So there's a space, there's a delay between when your atria contract and the next step. Now the next step is the Q, and really the Q and the R and the S are sort of one big complex. So that you know the difference, the Q interval is the first side, so it's the side that's going upwards, so we'll call that Q. And during this side, you'll see in your textbook, it's one of the places that has another little line underneath, and it's showing a sound. This is where you hear the first heart sound. So when you hear your heart beat, and it goes boom, 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 the first sound that you hear is right here. The reason is that valves are closing. Specifically, it's the bi- and tricuspid valves, the ones between the atria and the ventricles. So this makes sense. My atria got stimulated. They contracted, so blood went into my ventricles, and then the valves closed so that the blood could not go back. When the valves close and blood kind of splashes against them, that's what's making the sound. So that's the first heart sound. In the Q section and the R section, we'll say, this is when your ventricles contract. The Q would be the beginning, and the R would be the end. So ventricle contraction starts, and then ventricle stimulation finishes. And then at the end, where we have the T over here, we have the last little bump. This is where you get your second heart sound. So you'll notice in your textbook, it's showing you a little noise underneath. That's your second heart sound. This is when now your ventricles have relaxed and the semi-lunar valves close. So I would absolutely show you on a test an ECG and ask you what's happening in this part of the ECG. Which part of your heart is stimulated? When we're talking about atria, it's the SA node that's stimulated. When we're talking about ventricles down here, it's the AV node that's causing them to contract.